Good morning, everyone. Um, Today I had to choose the background picture because you didn't send me one, which is okay. So that's how Kyle Food should have looked like on Saturday. It probably didn't because there were less people. If you went to the game, I hope you had fun. I hope you took care of yourselves and you stay safe. If you watch the game at home, then I also hope you enjoy that. Let's go to our business. Today we'll begin discussing a whole new topic, moving away from, so far we talked a lot about foreign policy in the context of conflict and wars and those kinds of crises, but this week we'll talk a lot more about the economic angle of it. Before we go into this topic, let's do a quick review as always on last week's our discussion from the last meeting. So we kept the discussion on the individual level and the psychological studies of IR by focusing on political leaders. I talked about the two main schools of thought, the institutional leadership school, which focuses on the structural conditions, which makes it harder for leaders to have their own personal effect, but still personal circumstances matter, such as the turnover example I talked about with Kennedy and Khrushchev is another one. Then the focus on the leader attribute school, which emphasizes beliefs and individual dispositions as shaping the behavior of individual leaders, and that also affects the way that the country behaves in the international context. We talked about specific examples, the study by Herman, which focuses on personality traits and how that affects behavior in the IR context. So that was a little older study, and then more relevant recent studies focusing on past experiences, how those past experiences matter for actions that leaders exhibit in the international context. So past experience focusing on military, combat, and rebel experience, the Horowitz and Stam paper, showing that those who have military experience but no combat experience are actually more risk acceptant. They're more likely to engage in conflict compared to those who have combat experience, actually a better indicator for being risk averse and less likely to engage in international conflict. But I remind you that they added to that those individual factors interact with the domestic conditions, and in that sense they showed how domestic institutions such as the regime type matters in this case, and those effects are even more prominent in non-democracies. Last one was the Furman paper, which uses another type of past experience, in this case experience as an executive in the business sector, and how that affects contributions to military alliances, mostly showing that those who had that kind of experience are less likely to contribute a substantial amount of their expenditures to military alliances, which is, again, is a very contemporary, relevant topic in discussion now on the news. That captures the vast majority of the discussion we're going to have about political leaders. We're going to talk about leaders in a more specific context for specific topics later on this semester. If you have any questions, as always, you're more than welcome to either email me or come talk to me on office hours. All right, so the first part of the discussion today, it's going to be for today, and then the second part is going to be on Thursday. We'll introduce the economic angle of international politics, the role that governments play, the public role in that all interaction, and the strategic interactions among all those actors. So let's start with a little bit of a background. A couple of the questions that we are addressing in this case. Two of the primary puzzles or the aspects of international political economy are how government regulate cross-border and facilitate cross-border exchanges, and how trade, international trade, which is in essence those cross-border transactions, influences domestic as well as global prosperity. I'm sorry, not propensity. So the research has talked about several responsibilities that the government is expected to do in the context of international, in the global economy. First is regulating and taxing those cross-border transactions. Then guaranteeing the enforcement of contract through the legal system. And lastly, to monitor that the different actors comply with international rules as promoted by international institutions, which will be our topic for next week. So institutions such as the World Trade Organizations, the European Union, and others. Now, this is a very critical role. All those different roles are critical to ensure reasonable, secure, and stable currencies that allow the exchange of goods and services across borders, so we can use our money for buying things and selling things. This kind of exchange promotes a more efficient and equitable outcomes that benefit the welfare of all those who are part of the system, which essentially means that keeping with those roles for the government is important for the welfare of all citizens. The vast majority of the discussion today will focus on trade policy, both from the perspective of the government and then from the perspective of the citizens. So we'll have to start first with a little introduction about trade policy. What's the benefits, or why do we even talk about global trade? We have to start with the concept of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage describes every country's relative advantages in manufacturing some product in the sense of better income per production. That means that it's cheaper to produce a specific good in that country. That's what's called the comparative advantages. When economic actors, in this sense we're talking about different countries, are specializing in certain products that they can trade with one another and lower the costs, and both members of that interaction, both actors, actually gain more. So the exchange of products based on each actor actually specializing in his own field leads to overall growth. Now, what are the conditions that allow us to do these specializations? So one of them include the skills of the labor force, which is highly related or dependent on basic aspects such as education. For example, Israel is a very extended sector of high tech based on based on a wide-scale education in engineering and computer sciences, which provides Israel a comparative advantage in producing high-tech products. Another sets of factors that can lead to that specialty can be structural conditions as environmental conditions. For example, the United States has a lot more space and a much better climate for growing wheat. So it makes sense for American farmers in this case to focus on growing wheat. At the same time, France is the opposite. It has good climate and a good soil in certain parts of the country to grow grapes, which means better for the wine industry. So it makes more sense for French farmers to grow grapes and for the French economy to specialize in the production of wine. On the other hand, the American economy in this case, it makes more sense for that part of the economy to focus on the growth of wheat. That's another set of factors which explains how do we specialize in producing those. It's cheaper for Americans to grow wheat than for Americans to grow grapes, which means the production of wine. They can, it's less efficient. From the consumer standpoint, focusing on the comparative advantage allows actors to produce more, then engage in trade in the global market, enjoy greater income. Greater income from producers means they can offer more compensation for the workers, again, essentially meaning higher wages. And at the same time, that global competition and global market exchanges means that the prices of the products are lower. And overall, what that means, we get paid more, we pay less for the products that we want, so we get more free income. We can spend more of our income on additional products. That's better for us. So again, this is an advantage for all the consumers. As consumers, we all benefit from increased competition and lower prices. But we need to think about, and I want to take a step back for a second to understand what sets global prices. Global prices are a product of the equilibrium between what's called the supply, which is how much the producers are manufacturing, and the demand, how much we, the consumers, want. So let's talk a little bit about the system of the market competition, of the global market competitions. So consumers, as I said, want low prices so they can buy more of the goods that they want. Producers usually want to maximize their profit. So they will prefer to sell at the highest possible price. But if they will demand too much of a higher price for the product, we're just not going to buy it. We're going to buy something else. So what we end up is with a price which is an equilibrium of those both supply and demand, which are determined independently and the price is the outcome of this interaction. Our demand for goods is independently determined from the production of those goods by producers, and the interaction of those leads to the equilibrium price between supply and demand. This is what's called a Nash equilibrium. If you are familiar with John Nash, he's a mathematician who actually died a couple of years ago in a car accident, if I remember correctly. He's responsible for a lot of those scientific and research findings. One of the famous ones that you probably came across is his Nash equilibrium in the context of the prisoner's dilemma, right? The most efficient outcome from prisoner's dilemma, when you think about that, is for each one of the sides of the interactions to cooperate with another. This is what's called the Nash equilibrium. And Nash equilibrium describes a stable state of the interactions. In this case, we're talking about an economic interaction, so between consumers and producers. This is a stable state in which no actors is better off by moving away from that outcome. So the price that is set between consumers and producers is the best outcome, and demanding higher price is going to make one of the sides not better off, and demanding less is not going to make us better off. Okay, now this is a graphic representation of how prices are set, the demand and supply. If you've taken basic classes in economics, then none of this is going to be new to you. We have the demand curve, which is how much consumers are demanding of a product, and the supply curve, how much the manufacturers are supplying. And what you have between them is the equilibrium point of the price. So in this case, consumers are willing to pay $3 for a slice of pizza, which is pretty high, but all right. And for consumers, it's the most efficient and most useful for them to produce 8 quantities of pizza, 8 slices in that case, for that price. That's the equilibrium product. Now, how those things can move independently, as we said, if for some reason, and we'll talk about those reasons in a minute, consumers are producers are manufacturing less of that pizza, then this specific curve is going to move to the left, which means it's going to be somewhere around here because there's less pizza available in the marketplace. What that means, if there's still the same amount of demand, then the price is going to be set somewhere around here, which means the price is going to be higher. That's one of the reasons that we're pushing for more competition, more firms to enter the market. If we have, instead of just 2 firms producing pizza, and that's the price we get, if now we get 4 firms, then the amount of pizza available to us is going to be higher. That's going to shift this curve over here. And again, the price will be lower. Okay. That's just basic economic principles, and I'll get back to that in a second when I talk about the government. How does the government factors into this interaction? So one of the most common acts of governing the economy is the institution of taxes. What happens when taxes are levied? Whether the taxes are business taxes, whether they are individual taxes, they shape the demand and supply curves. And the bottom line in most cases is that leads to an increase in prices. Let's go back for a minute for this slide to see an example. So if now there's any kinds of taxing on the suppliers, they have to pay more. That means that it costs more for those suppliers of, again, our example is pizza, it's costing them more to produce the pizza. So either they will want more price, or just in terms of if the price is set at $3, they will just produce less because it costs more for those producers to make the pizza at that price. That means, again, that the supply is going to be lower. And again, this curve will shift, and that leads in the long run to higher prices for pizza. So that's the idea of taxes. A tariff is a tax on foreign product. The idea behind a tariff is to secure the domestic manufacturers and reduce their relatively weaker position in the global competition. However, a tariff is a tax on that manufacturers are suffering from. So again, if we go back to that example again, if we have here 2 firms that provide pizza in our own area, one of them is importing the pizza from Italy or whatever, the other one is producing it here in College Station. Now the one that imports the pizza from Italy has to pay more for their product because there is a tax. They have to pay more for that. So again, that provides them incentives to actually buy less pizza from Italy and bring it here. So that means in the overall, again, the supply of pizza here in College Station is going to be lower. So the prices for us will be higher. Another adverse effect of tariffs is that for the domestic producers of pizza, there's less incentives to be efficient because they will still get the price, which in this case was still $3 for pizza, but they don't pay the extra price because they don't pay tax on the foreign product. They don't pay the tariff. So they have less incentive to be efficient, which overall over time leads to lower prices. And lastly, for consumers, the higher price of the product, the higher price of the pizza because of those taxes means we're going to have less money to spend on other products. We cannot buy beer, or we cannot buy whatever. We cannot buy burgers because we have to pay more for our pizza. That's the idea behind that. Okay, let's shift a little bit more to talk about really the government and the effects of it in the context of international trade. There's two contrasting views of what the government does in the context of international trade. On the one hand, does the government focus on protecting domestic firms and fostering their success versus the global marketplace? On the other hand, is the government more focusing on fostering global competition, less intervention in the marketplace, which essentially leads, as I talked about earlier, to lower prices for consumers? So there's a tension here, which is, does the government, emphasize the welfare of the citizens, or does it prioritize the survival of the firms? Essentially, it suggests there's a trade-off between promoting free trade and supporting protectionist policies. The question in this case is, why would government choose protectionist policies over free trade or the other way around? That's the question we're trying to address here. All right, let's answer the question. One of the primary reasons for questions about protection versus free trade, or mostly the question is phrased as why does government pursue protection policies, is the distributional consequences of free trade. Essentially, it means, and I've talked about that in previous lectures when I talked about liberalism, if you remember, now we'll go a lot more in details to talk about that, is that there are uneven benefits or uneven awards from free trade, and those groups, those who gain more or those who gain less, will push for different policies. And that means that groups that gain benefits from free trade will promote more liberalization. On the other hand, groups that suffer from free trade will actually push for more protection. That's the idea behind it. Now, if we want to understand a little bit more about how those views are shaped, we'll have to take another short detour from talking about political economy and go back to talk about economics 101 or 102, whatever the name of the course is, and describe basic models of global economies. So there's two economic models that explain trade attitudes and protection policies. The first one is called the factor endowment model. This model relies on what is termed as the Stoffel-Samuelson theorem. That theorem describes what's called the factors of production. The factors of production, there's two of the main sets of factors that affect production in a basic economy. There's labor, which is us, the people that work in the economy, and there's the capital, which is the money that can be moved around. According to the factor endowment model, those factors of production can move relatively easily between sectors. So I can shift my job between different sectors, between the education sector and the manufacturing sector and the high-tech sector relatively easily. And a change from free trade to more protection will raise the incomes of factors that have relatively scarce in the country, and it will lower the income for the factors that are relatively abundant in the country. That's a lot of theoretical arguments here, and let's try to break it down a little so we can understand. That means that open trade will benefit those who have abundant of factors in those sectors, and I'll give examples in a second to make it a little bit clearer. And protection will actually favor those who are scarce in the factors in those specific sectors. So that means that the easiest example we can think about, high-skilled workers usually tend to be in places in which they are abundant and they are benefiting from free trade, are more likely to support free trade. Low-skilled workers, which operate in scarce sectors, tend to oppose that and to favor protectionism. The other model is the Ricardo-Wiener model. The Ricardo-Wiener model assumes that one of those factors, either the either the sorry, either the labor or the capital. One of them is immobile, so we cannot move that easily. And the preferences of the public regarding, and the preferences of the different actors regarding trade policy will depend on how that different policies will affect the industry in which they are working in. So individuals that work in export-oriented sectors of the economy will support open trade because they personally benefit from that. On the other hand, those who work in import competing economies or sectors of the economy will be more protectionist. Let's take a little bit on examples in order to a little bit to better understand those different models. For de facto endowment model, the United States has an abundance. There's a lot of highly educated, highly skilled workers. That means that free trade benefits those specific workers. Those workers are more likely to support free trade because it also means that demand for those workers is more. So those people are more likely members, citizens of the United States, people that are graduates of the education system in the United States are more skilled. There will be higher demand for those positions. So those people are more likely to support free trade. At the same time, in places or sectors which mostly rely on low skill, on a lot of labor, and they're very sensitive to imports, those kinds of sectors are more likely to suffer from free trade, so they're more likely to favor protectionism. As an example in that, and I've already talked about example, is farmers. Farming, agriculture is considered a relatively low-skill, labor-intensive industries. It's not. I'm not, for no reason at all, I'm not discounting farmers. Their work is their job is very, very hard. I don't think I'll be able to do that. But again, from a macroeconomic standpoint, this industry is seen as a low-skill, labor-intensive, and those individuals are suffering more from open trade and the fact that products can be exported and imported, and that means they're more likely to favor protectionism. Those models that I've talked about focus mostly on the demand side of protection policy. What leads to the consumers or the public to have different views about protection policies versus free trade? There's a lot of research that argues that we need to actually complement the discussion and talk about the supply side. And the supply side is where these policies are coming from, which means we need to focus on political institutions. The idea behind that is to focus on how different domestic political institutions, how interest groups promote different policies leads to either more support for trade policy or more support for protectionist policy. And that's what we're going to shift and talk about today. So now we're going to move and talk now about the idea of free trade, globalization, and in terms of looking at domestic political institutions, we'll look at regimes. Let's take a look at a more aggregated, a more wide-scale view of free trade. I already mentioned the benefits of free trade to consumers, particularly to the economy as a whole. An expansion of such policies leads to greater global integration. Countries become more interdependent on one another. You remember when I talked about liberalism, I talked about the concept of interdependence. They become more related to one another through the exchange of products, multilateral exchange of goods and services and capital. That's one of the economic outcomes of more free trade, global free trade. In addition, we can think about a political implication in this case, and that's further integration between countries can lead to the spread of ideas and norms, mostly norms and ideas that are rooted in democracies. And if we add that to the economic benefits that are already spreading because of those global trade, there should be larger support between those countries to democratic regime. What essentially that means is that free trade should also promote or lead to more democracies, more support for democracies across the globe. I'll talk about now about this paper. This is a paper by Professor Lee and Ruvani. Professor Lee is one of the professors here in the political science department here at Texas A&M. What they did is they wanted to test whether there's those mechanisms that relate to globalism and free trade are actually helping democracy or they are harming democracy. So first, let's talk about the different mechanisms that promote democracy or democratic institution. The first is economic growth, helps the middle class, provides better access to education, and overall supposed to reduce inequalities. Another mechanism is that states who want to increase their revenues must work harder to have greater political stability and ensure peace, because conflict is another cost that you have to think about. Closer links between countries which engage in trading with one another create incentive for those cooperations, creates a demand for democratic regimes which are more stable and accommodating those interests, which means that for dictators, those dictators, because of greater globalization and trade, they face pressure to alter their behavior and not engage in those and not sustain those kinds of regimes. Third is the role of the market here. Now, speaking of dictators, they tend to hold on to their power by what's called extracting rents, extracting income from capital that is supposed to be intended for society. So a lot of the money that dictators are collecting is not being invested back in the citizens, but it's kept for their own personal benefit. However, globalization, and by allowing the market to penetrate those kinds of countries, it's going to reduce the incentives for extracting rents, and it's going to replace those kinds of behavior because the market will take that place here, and dictators will have less incentives to sustain those kinds of regimes and to behave in that way. Globalization also reduces the cost of information. It enhances the flow of information across partners and those who are partners in economic interaction. Democratic states can more easily export their values through their free media, and that puts more pressure on non-democratic countries to alter their behavior because the citizens of those countries become more informed about the benefits of free trade and the benefits of democracy. Think about what happened in Eastern Europe when the ideas of democracy coming from the West, not just American, but coming from the West, penetrated those countries. Then those citizens were able to put more pressure on the local government, and that was one of the explanations leading to the adoption of democracies in some of those countries. In Eastern Europe, it's just one example. The last mechanism is that globalization will strengthen domestic institutions that support democracies. An efficient market requires a system that adheres to property rights, impartial judiciary, the adoption of different norms of law, and accepting civil and human rights. And global institutions can promote those kinds of things as well as transparency and accountability, and again, reduce state intervention and increase the democratic aspect of those countries. At the same time, the study also proposes different mechanisms in which globalization and free trade actually harm democracy. For example, globalization leads to increased movement of capital and better allocations of means of production, which means that puts us back into some of the models we talked about. It's easier to move capital around when trade is free. It's not that easy for members of the labor force to move around. Now, because it's easier to move capital when facing those kinds of systems, it means it's harder for the governments, the local governments, to promote domestic policies. They're more likely to favor they have more incentives to please foreign investors and not support the local economy. At the same time, globalization is easier for capital mobility, but globalization does not mean that mobility between sectors for labor is easier to actually manifest. So it's harder to move between sectors. That means that different sectors in society will lose their support from capital, which moves out of the country, and those sectors may be out of work. That's one long interpretation of this idea of the distributional outcomes of free trade. Another potential aspect is that the competition in the global market harms local firms that cannot adjust their operations fast enough facing the global competition. The government that may want to compensate those firms also will suffer from lower tax rates because those governments will lower the taxes so those firms can have more money to invest in their operations. But those combinations of factors will make it harder for those governments to promote expanded welfare programs. Because if I'm reducing the tax base, I'm collecting less taxes from the citizens, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I provide some kind of subsidiaries to the sectors in the economy that are suffering from the global competition, that means that there's not enough money left to actually provide welfare benefits or welfare programs to the citizens, which means that it's harming the citizens, it's harming mostly the poor. Free flow of capital can produce economic crises. Economic crises harm the less endowed more than everyone. So the poor suffer the most from economic crises. It also promotes or leads to a greater support along the public to a stronger identity and ethnic politics, which harms the basic democratic ideas. All those combination of factors actually leads to more social cleavages, which harms the consolidations of democracy. Last one is that globalization reduces the importance of aspects such as nationality, of citizenship, because the focus actually shifts to multinational views on multinational corporations making their profits, and there's less attention on civic commitment and public commitment, which again harms democracy from a normal standpoint. So what is those authors are doing? They're using data on 127 countries between 1970 and 1996. They use different measures for trade flows. They use for globalization. They use measures for trade flows between countries, and for measuring the different levels of democracies, they use democracy scores from the polity data, which I talked about a little bit on last week. So what are some of their findings? They find that global trade, has a negative short-term effect on democracy. So overall, trade has benefits for democracies, but it has a short-term negative effects. It generates those winners and losers, as I talked about before, regarding the distribution consequences of trade. The process that leads to distribution of those gains is relatively slow, so overall it has a negative effect on democracy. FDIs, which is foreign direct investment, has both positive and negative effects. On the one hand, it fosters growth and the progress in technology. At the same time, it does increase inequalities. One of the reasons for that is that FDI tends to relocate the cheaper production places. If foreign investors tend to prefer to invest their money in places where production is cheaper. That also provides incentive for global firms to intervene in the local politics of those countries. In many cases, those are developing countries and not developed ones. And overall, it has negative effects, and it counteracts the potentially positive effects that FDI offers. Lastly, in terms of the diffusion of ideas, the political aspect of globalization, they actually find positive effect for that. So countries which were more tend to have economic cooperation between them were more likely to share those democratic values. The bottom line is that they argue that in order to mitigate some of those negative effects, there is a need for a global coordination of socio-economic policies between the different actors. So countries need to come up with more cooperations among them, more coordinations among them regarding the different types of policies that they implement, socio-economic policies, in order to reduce some of the costs that global trade produces, but at the same time sustain the benefits. Which essentially means that if you are familiar with one of the famous quotes of the 1992 electoral elections between Clinton and incumbent Bush at the time, was the idea talking about, it was called that it's the economy, stupid. That was the term that was used back then, trying to focus the discussion about the economic problem the United States was facing at the time and not the foreign policy problems after the Cold War. But in reality, it's not the economy, it's the political aspect of the economy, because those are the different policies that we implement in order to try and compensate or not compensate for the adverse effects of free trade. And that's the problem that creates those kinds of negative effects for free trade. It's not the basic economic principles that guide those kinds of ideas. Now, what I want to show you now is a short clip from the West Wing TV series. It shows very nicely a lot of the elements that I talked about so far. Think about when you watch that video, it's about a three minute video I'm going to share with you right now. Think about some of the statements that those different actors, those different characters are presenting, the points that the president talks about, and then the counters that his advisors has regarding economic policy and how economic policy is being viewed. think about the discussion at the end of those 3-minute clip between two of the characters here. One of them is one of the senior advisors to the president. His name is Josh Lyman. He talks, and the other one is another senior advisor to the vice president, and they talk about prices in the global trade economy, but they also mention, and that's part of those distributional effect discussion, the human face of global trade. So let's spend those couple of minutes to see this short clip to give us some sense of all those different arguments that we've talked about. All right, so sorry for the quick delay. Here is the clip, just a second. Right.
Free trade people who say it exports jobs. That giant sucking sound. Any half-decent economist will tell you to wear earplugs, sir, then file immediately for unemployment. Sir, have you read the talking points? I'm an economist. Some would say half-decent. I don't need a primer on this. Due respect, sir, your answers on economic issues could be a bit polysyllabic. Academic. I was going to go with incomprehensible. Hey, listen. Any economic advancement involves what Schumpeter called creative.
Does that word destruction will really mollify our critics?
Free trade creates jobs.
Selling our products to the world.
Creates better, higher paying jobs. It's got to be that simple or we lose the argument. Anybody have any crayons so I can color in my PhD?
Josh makes a point. We're losing old economy jobs in steel and textiles all across manufacturing.
And economics, clearly. That's why we fought so hard in this deal for copyright enforcement, to protect the fruits of the new economy. Technology, inventions, ideas, the stuff where America can't be beat, where they can't do it in Malaysia for $1 a day. Okay.
What about these tractor protests in the streets of Brussels?
Global economic forces are unstoppable, just like technology itself. Should we have banned ATMs to protect bank tellers or digital watches to prop up the folks who fix grandfather clocks?
Free trade creates better, higher paying jobs.
It's got to be that simple. The president bashing the clock industry in here.
India.
Chase Computer Networks broke off the top. Signed on. 17,000 jobs because of the deal I just negotiated. That's what they think. Who knows about this? No one? You don't? You don't? We may have a situation in Congress. Where were we?
Creating better, higher paying jobs.
In all, the union claims 72,000 white-collar jobs will be shipped to India.
No, Congress. Yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah, I understand.
What are you doing out here?
Donna's not talking to me. Plus, there's some soon-to-be unemployed workers camped out in my office.
With tractors, I presume.
Something like that.
Think this job story is true?
It's proprietary.
Think it'll give the GOP an excuse to squash this trade deal?
With midterms coming up, what do you think? How'd you become a free trade?
America has a quarter of the world's wealth and only 2% of the customers. You have to sell to others.
So how do you make that case to people who are going to lose jobs?
Ask them how often they go to Walmart to buy cheap cardigans or drill bits.
Drill bits?
I don't wear cardigans,
Okay.
but I like a nice drill bit.
So it all comes down to cheap drill bits.
Pay more for a drill bit, you have less to spend on other things. Keep out cheap foreign drill bits, and that country will keep out cheap American something else, and that costs us jobs.
Do you ever wonder if we forget the human face of trade, the blood and muscle?
You have to go with what grows the economy for everyone. There's blood and muscle in India, too.
Yeah.
Hoynes was pretty critical of free trade when you worked for him, wasn't he?
Yeah, that was mostly politics.
So how'd you become a free trader?
I came to work for him. Did you need something?
The vice president is going to distance himself from this trade deal. You did a great job. It's mostly politics.
All right, so as you saw in this video, there's a lot of stuff going on here at the same time. A lot of also, domestic congressional fighting. But overall, that is some of the points that I've mentioned here, and this whole discussion about the consequences of free trade and how do we come to that, and the idea that we need to come up with policies which better compensate for the negative effects of free trade. All right, so far we've discussed the theoretical logic of global trade, also mentioning how it should be viewed by the public. But in order for us to better understand how the public actually, what actually the public thinks about free trade, we actually need to measure those attitudes. So let's do just that. I discussed the distribution consequences of trade a few more times, and those consequences are important in shaping the public attitudes. How much does each one of us get from free trade, which is essential to our view about what do we think about these kind of policies. From a theoretical standpoint, that's based on both models, the factor endowment or the Ricardo-Weiner models that we've mentioned. But I want to talk about additional factors that come into play in shaping those attitudes. One of the central ones here is education. The vast majority of studies finds a significant correlation between higher education and support for free trade. In most of those studies, education is viewed as an indicator for skills, so highly educated or highly skilled individuals. So that provides support for those models, in this case, the factor endowment model, because those who are high skill are more benefiting from free trade, they are more likely to support that. But it is not that clear what this relationship, what is the relationship between education and support for free trade actually represents. Because other explanations suggest that education is a signal for different levels of tolerance towards outgroups, risk profile, tendency to engage in dogmatism, or delay gratification. If you're familiar with the famous marshmallow test, the one which puts little kids with marshmallow and see how long they can actually wait to get an additional marshmallow, this has been shown to be correlated with education and with what the author said back then, success in life. And I don't want to go into the marshmallow test experiment, but this is what's called delayed gratification. How much are you willing to wait in order to get more gratification? So if those indicators, if those tolerance for outgroups and dogmatism and delayed gratifications are actually better predictors of trade attitudes regarding trade policy, then the argument that economic well-being is the foundation of what education level is incorrect, or just a different interpretation of what education actually represents. There's another explanation, or another possibility of what education represents. Education represents different levels of knowledge that we have regarding economic principles. And that's the idea that the role that information plays, the amount of information that each one of us has regarding economic principles and economic policies and economic outcomes, and how that relates to our trade attitudes. The type of information that we are exposed to matters a lot for those attitudes. For example, you are here taking classes in a university, so part of your college education, you're learning. Some of you are taking classes about economics. I talked about economics today. I'm going to talk about economics on Thursday. So you're exposed to information that explains those basic economic principles, what is supposed to be the benefits. I've also talked a lot about the cost and the adverse effects of those kinds of economic interactions, but you're exposed to that information. And overall, since the mainstream economic theory supports free trade, those individuals that take college courses that talks about those economic theories are more likely to support free trade. So college-educated individuals are more likely to support free trade. Now, think about that compared to members of different trade unions. Members of trade unions are more likely to be exposed to information that highlights the risks of global trade, because global trade means that our job is being shifted to other countries, just like they talk about in the West Wing clip. Right? Some of those textile positions are being moved away from the United States. So those members in those sectors in textile manufacturing are being exposed to information telling them that free trade means you're going to lose your job. So that should also affect their attitudes. Now, our expectation is that the most powerful factor shaping our attitudes is a reality that we face. So any kind of threat to my own livelihood will be critical for my preferences regarding those kinds of questions. However, what we actually find in a lot of those researchers, and I'm going to talk about this another study in a minute, is that self-interest is not that much of a significant factor in shaping those kinds of attitudes. Now, one of the reasons for that is the difficulty for individuals to link what are the outcomes of public policies, how that's going to affect me individually. Think about again to the beginning of the video clip we just saw, and the person talking about Schumpeter and the effects of economic policies and destruction, and how his advisors jumped that fast and stopped him and saying, yes, don't use the word destruction. That exchange actually represents the fact that for citizens, the members of the common man, it's much harder to understand how those economic policies are being translated to my personal life. A lot of them also do not understand these economic models, right? Those who go and take college classes and they teach about economic models, they will understand those economic models, but not all of them do that. So again, it's harder for individuals to connect between those public policies to what actually it comes up to in their personal life. Instead, people tend to construct their attitudes based on the more collective view or a more national level information. How does the policy affect the country as a whole? So that means that if I lose my job, losing my job does not necessarily affect my views about trade policy or economic policies as a whole, compared to what is my perception about the state of the economy in a whole. And this is what's called, and I've mentioned that concept already, sociotropic preferences. So even if those individuals here still have their job and have their income and everything is fine in their own personal life because they're working, when they see on the news that there are news on a disaster when it comes to the unemployment in the United States, then their views are most likely to be shaped by that type of information compared to their own personal state. Okay, so let's talk about the research itself. This is one of the two readings that you had for today, the Mansfield and Mutz paper, which measures directly free trade attitudes by the public. They conduct a direct test of this logic, that it's not just economic factors that matter for public attitudes, and they also account for individual levels factors and how that shapes the public attitudes toward free trade. One of the most important innovations that they introduced in their work back at the time, 2009, is that they add factors that are beyond the economy. So they look at factors such as ethnocentric views and how that shapes your view about global trade and trade policy. They measured that using 2 national representative samples in 2007, 2004, and they used survey items. So I'll just give you an example. I took one example for survey questions that measures those kinds of attitudes. So this is a survey question. I'm going to read you some actions that the government does, blah, blah, blah. How much do you favor or oppose? And in this case, the focus is how about the government negotiating in a free trade agreement like NAFTA? Do you favor or oppose that? Now, this is one of the ways that those kinds of scholars are using to measure support for free trade or support for trade policies. We can think about the potential problems with the survey itself and the way that the question is framed. But if you think about that, the question is framed in a way that is being asked, how do you think, or how much do you support the government negotiating this trade? And it does not ask, what do you support, favor, or oppose those kinds of actions and how that relates to you specifically. It's just what is your opinion. So it makes sense also that a lot of the people that answer those kinds of surveys will also think about the state of the economy as a whole. Okay, before I finish up with the findings of that research, I want to just stop for the attendance word today. So the attendance word is old. Old is the attendance word for today. Some of the main findings that they have. First of all, they find that education, especially graduate level education, is highly significant for support of free trade, but put a sticker on that. We'll get back to that in a second. They find almost no evidence for the effects of self-interest on public views of trade policy. This is one of the figures they show there. This is the breakdown of answer to those questions of how do you view the impact of trade on your family compared to how does trade policy affect the US economy as a whole. And as you can see, the only place where family financial situation, the darker bars, are higher is for the answer of no effect. Whenever the answer is positive or negative, and it doesn't matter here for, at the moment, it doesn't matter whether it's the positive or negative effect, it's always the US economy more than my own personal situation. And that's exactly the idea, that it's not self-interest that's driving those attitudes. is the view of the economy as a whole that's driving my attitude regarding a trade policy. The most powerful predictors that they find is, as I said, these sociotropic views got related to the US economy. They also find union membership to have a strong effect, a strong negative effect on support for trade. And in addition, they also talk about other non-economic factors which are important, such as isolationism or ethnocentrism. Those two are very strong predictors of opposing a trade policy. The more ethnocentric an individual is, the more likely it is that she will not support global trade policy. So those are some of the findings they show, and how exactly our public attitudes regarding free trade are driven not by what a lot of those economic models are assuming, but actually by other factors. Another interesting finding they have, I told you to put the education finding on the side, so now let's take it away. When they include education along with those kinds of factors here, those individual factors like this, the effect of education is actually becomes non-significant, which means that education actually is a better indicator for those kinds of factors, which means out-group anxiety and ethnocentrism is better also measured by different level of education than they are by measuring economic self-interest. That's part of the finding. All right, so that was my version of Economic 101 for political economy. I talked a lot about those trade policy. On Thursday, we're going to talk more about different governmental actions in the economic sphere. If you want to read more, you're more than welcome to go and find those articles and read them. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to talk to me. Reminding you again that the deadline for your midterm task is this Friday at midnight. So again, if you are still behind or you have any things that you need my help with, send me an email, come talk to me in office hours. We'll take care of it. And with that, I am going to say goodbye, and I will see you on Thursday. Bye, everyone.